shares are just getting hammered this morning.
Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate. We're down over 16%. Dow at the same time has fallen about 18%.
90 to 166 in the blink of an eye.
On the NASDAQ, everything and more has been completely wiped out.
It was the worst day on Wall Street since the crash of 1987.
Please take a second to subscribe, then like and share afterwards. We can really use your support. Thank you. In the previous episode, we completed the final line of the Isaiah 9:10 passage in the American era and the cedar tree. We took a brief look at verses 8 and 9 that led us to discover that the vow was to take place in the capital city by the leaders of the land. But now it's time to look at the verse directly following Isaiah 9:10. Verse 11 states, "Therefore the Lord shall set up the adversaries of Rezin against him, and spur his enemies on." So what are we to make of this verse? The nation's first shaking is followed by a second. This is because the nation did not wake up or turn back after the first. And to put it into perspective, we can look at it this way. Isaiah 9:10 is a vow of defiance, as we have seen, but Isaiah 9:11 is a prophecy of future calamity. The two are connected, and one leads into the other, or to be more precise, the first brings about the second. That means because they made a vow to defy the first calamity of September 11th, the nation ends up ushering in the second. If a gardener tries to remove a weed from its garden by cutting off its leaves, the leaves would soon grow back. But if he cut off the stem, it would soon sprout another. His efforts are doomed to fail. It's like dealing with the symptoms and not the cause or root behind it. For the gardener, the cause lies beneath the surface, in the roots. The same with America. They waged a war in Afghanistan and later in Iraq. Whether they solve one problem after another problem, another will reappear, and another, until they finally deal with the root of the problem. With Israel, their problem was a spiritual problem, its separation from God. Everything happening to them were just symptoms or manifestations of that spiritual problem. Their vow to rebuild in Isaiah 9:10 was like the gardener attempting to remove the weed by cutting off its leaves. Their problem wasn't really the Assyrians, and their solution wasn't political, economic, or even military intervention, because only such solutions cause another crisis. The only solution is to return to God. As Israel rebuilt after the destruction, it created a sense of national resurgence. That illusion made them blind, and they continued building up their house of cards while being deaf to the warnings of the prophets, until it would all collapse in 70 AD. We know the rest of that story. Now, we arrive to the next stage. We can see now that these warnings lead to either redemption or calamity, depending on how the nation responds to it. And we know now that America chose to ignore the warning after 9/11. Therefore, they opened themselves up to the next stage, as their ignorance set in motion a chain of events to bring about the very calamity that sought to avert it. 7 years after 9/11, the American economy collapsed, triggering a global economic implosion. Behind it all, and all that followed, was something much deeper than economics. Behind the collapse of Wall Street and the American economy was Isaiah 9:10. The explanations for an economic collapse are endless. No one factor stands alone. Analysts can dig deep and far in time to search for causes, but the Isaiah 9:10 effect teaches us that the second calamity must be effectively born out of the first, and out of the nation's poor response to that first calamity. America would attempt to fulfill the ancient vow of defiance proclaimed from Capitol Hill. It wasn't just for ground zero, but for rebuilding the entire nation. In fact, it became the nation's foreign and domestic policy. You see, when Israel vowed to rebuild, it meant rebuilding their buildings, towers, homes, and most importantly, their walls. The walls were to fortify their defenses so as to become invulnerable to future attacks. In the same way, America would embark on a campaign to rebuild its walls of protection, to strengthen and fortify its systems of defense. They established the Department of Homeland Security, launched the first war on terror, and began revamping cybersecurity protocols. This campaign on all these fronts required massive expenditures. The war on terror alone would add multiple billions of dollars to the federal budget. Funds and resources that otherwise would have been used to strengthen the American economy were now diverted and drained away from investment. The war in Iraq would impel a surging of oil prices, further draining the nation's GDP. Government spending would lead to the skyrocketing of the national debt. All born out of the ruins of 9/11. And even more directly, there was something else. On September 11th, the New York Stock Exchange closed down and would remain closed for 6 grueling days. When it reopened the following Monday, it would suffer the largest point crash in Wall Street history up to that time. That same Monday, the Federal Reserve slashed its target interest rate by 50 basis points. Over the next 3 months, it would be slashed several more times until hitting 1.75% on December 11th, 2001. Essentially, 9/11 forced the interest rate below the rate of inflation. It is, essentially, the equivalent of creating free money. The Treasury would continue its extreme suppression of interest rates for quite some time. It would dip under 2% and remain so for several years. This would be the catalyst for bringing down the American and global economy. An era of easy money began. Easy loans, easy borrowing, easy mortgages. This created an unprecedented housing and building boom. Homeowners began to borrow and spend against the rising value of their homes. This would create credit bubbles throughout the economy. This phenomenon spread across the world, the continuing effect of 9/11. And ultimately the Isaiah 9:10 effect. And as this was all taking place, the nation was in further spiritual decline and more rapidly departing from God. God was calling it back, allowing it to be shaken, to wake it up and save it from judgment. But America has not turned back to Him, just like the foolish gardener. Ancient Israel began on their rebuilding campaign with a massive wave of construction throughout the land. It was a building boom. So too with America, and it was linked to the suppression of interest rates, which is linked to the vow, "We will rebuild." all the trappings of its national resurgence would then be exposed as having been hollow, empty, and deceptive right from the start. It was a house of cards. The standard cautions and restraints involved in borrowing and loaning would be thrown out the window. Banks were making loans they would have normally never otherwise made. Consumers were spending money they never otherwise would have spent, and they were buying houses when they really couldn't afford or had any real credit to. Personal, government, and corporate debt mushroomed, and with increased pressure to produce even greater profits, investment and banking firms would become involved with increasingly risky transactions and practices. The illusion only held up for so long as it kept booming. But once the stock market would begin to falter or the flow of credit begin to dry up, that illusion would set off the collapse. Then, in September of 2008, the American financial system began to implode, triggering the greatest economic disaster since the Great Depression of the 1930s. This would lead into an American-led global economic implosion. The house of cards was collapsing and drawing the world into its fall. And behind the entire global economic collapse was Isaiah 9:10, and it began in the ruins of 9/11. It would take a few years, but economic analysts and observers began to see the connection between the implosion and 9/11, citing the cutting of interest rates immediately after the terrorist attacks. It was essentially Isaiah 9:10 translated into modern economics, and no one realized it was all part of the ancient mystery. There is yet another prophecy from the book of Ezekiel concerning the uncovering of the foundations. It states, "So I will break down the wall you have plastered with untampered mortar, and bring it down to the ground, so that its foundation will be uncovered. It will fall, and you shall be consumed in the midst of it. Then you shall know that I am the Lord." Ezekiel 13:14. On the surface, it is speaking about the foundations of a wall. It also means the base of which something stands, or on which something was founded, or that in which it places its trust. The nations of the ancient world trusted in their idols and gods. Modern nations trust in their powers, their military, their economy, their resources. But what this passage is saying is that in the days of judgment, a nation's foundations are laid bare. Its idols fall, and its powers fail. Jeremiah 45:4. Behold, what I have built, I will break down, and what I have planted, I will pluck up. What is built up from the foundation, and what is broken down to the foundation. This is a sign of national judgment. The World Trade Center was the towering symbol of American financial power, a power centuries in the making and long connected to the island of Manhattan, the focal point of the country's economic and financial activity. Going back to the 17th century, the island served as a trading outpost for the Dutch. Those first traders and settlers soon felt the need to protect themselves from Indians, pirates, and other perceived dangers. So they built a wall. Along the wall, merchants opened up shops and set up warehouses. In time, the wall became the center point of the island's trade and commerce. The Dutch would eventually lose the island to the British. The British would then tear down the wall in 1699. A roadway that followed the path of this wall would continue to bear the name Wall Street. Wall Street would continue to be the center of finance. It laid the foundation for America's ascent as the world's preeminent financial superpower. And what truly made it a superpower started in 1792 when that secret meeting took place at a Manhattan hotel. And as we covered in episode 9, The Sycamore, the agreement was signed under a buttonwood tree, which gave its name and became the foundation for the New York Stock Exchange. The buttonwood is another name for a sycamore tree. And like we outlined in that episode, the judgment of 9/11 would cause the collapse of the World Trade Center, which in turn caused the uprooting of the sycamore at ground zero. Now, as for the Ezekiel prophecy, the foundation of a nation's power would be uncovered, and the fall of the one would cause the fall of the other. The fall of the symbol that stands for Wall Street. The fallen sycamore was an omen to foreshadow what was to take place right here 7 years later in this same place for yet another collapse. This time, the collapse of the entire economy. Up next, we open up a whole other realm of mystery, symbolized by stalks of wheat that has been determining every collapse from the very beginning. Here on Prophecies Uncovered.